have to say, the 70s is one of those decades I was really excited to talk about. But as I looked into more and more, there was so much more than I even realized in this decade. So I'm really excited. Let's jump in. Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, we are continuing the Decades of Fantasy series. You guys have seemed to really enjoy these, and I've really liked doing these and just kind of looking into all this stuff. And we are doing the 70s today. And the 70s are interesting for a lot of reasons. There was actually quite a lot going on. And I talked about in the last one with the 60s being, sort of a golden age of fantasy and sci-fi. A lot of stuff coming into the mainstream, a lot of it coming with Lord of the Rings being really popular, having a lot to do with it, as well as other factors as well. But there's a lot of that going on, and then we see that spill over to the 70s having quite a lot. And there's definitely a few different things, big specific things I want to mention here with the 70s and going from here. So yeah, I'm pretty excited to talk about. So I'll mention a couple of series that I mentioned in the 60s video as well that did start in the 60s, but a lot of it ended up being published in the 60s. So like Dragon Riders of Pern by Anne McCaffrey, most of that actually was published in the 70s, even though it started. A lot of the Elric stuff and like that saga from Michael Moorcock, a lot of his stuff was done in the 70s as well, and you would see that going in there also. So a couple of things that I'll mention, just that those did continue on in a big way. But we had a lot of new stuff, different stuff, and stuff of some different styles, some stuff with some familiar styles, and kind of a mix. So the first two things that I want to mention, which feel both a little bit different, but we have the first one being the Chronicles of Amber by Roger Zelazny. Now, the Chronicles of Amber, I've only read the first two books so far. I am planning to definitely continue. These, though, it's very much fantasy, but at the same time, you can feel a lot of that kind of sci-fi elements in there as well. And so this comes, I talked about, especially pre-60s and even a lot in the 60s and in this time period as well. We'll talk about it, there's several, but sci-fi fantasy, a lot of it was pretty mixed, and there's a lot of debate. There's some novels that maybe were marketed as fantasy, but people definitely think they're sci-fi, or marketed more as sci-fi but are more fantasy. There wasn't as much of a divide, and Amber feels like a series that's kind of born from that. It's fantasy, but it's definitely coming from the side of, you don't necessarily need a clean break because it's very odd. It involves like shifting between worlds and like stuff like that, although with a very much a fantasy feel. So that's a kind of a really interesting series, and I feel like seeing some unique things, some different stuff, some experimental stuff. You saw a bit of that in the 70s, while also seeing stuff that you expect as well. So those ones I want to mention. Something else that is in a lot of ways is kind of a response in some ways to the Lord of the Rings, maybe not directly, but has some of that style, but done in a really different way, and is just really trying to look at different things, is a series that I'm a big fan of, The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever by Stephen R. Donaldson. The original trilogy, which was published in the 70s, and this is a series again that is different. It has a lot of classic fantasy feel, but is looking instead at a very unlikable main character. And there's thematically, like reading the trilogy and then reading even the second trilogy, there's a lot of recurring themes. But it's showing how somebody, even if they're surrounded by beauty, is going to look at the negative. And so there's a lot of deeper themes. But having that kind of thing, that kind of spin on that type of fantasy, is also something a little bit different, and something I really enjoyed about that series. And so that's also something that you had starting in this decade. What I will mention, because I've heard of this series, and I did not realize it was actually from the 70s, but the Derini, I think is called, or Derini maybe, by Catherine Kurtz, which is the series. It's historical fantasy, but it's something that has actually been on my list a long time. I didn't realize was here. So that's kind of an interesting one. Again, kind of a different one. And I think already you can kind of see that the 70s is a little hard to characterize because there was just a lot of fantasy. And so it's a decade where it just felt like almost anything would go. And, you could, fantasy was just in a boom still from the 60s. And so there was just, we're like, hey, if it's fantasy, let's go. There's a lot of sci-fi. And so already we've talked about some different kinds. Now, something else that I noticed is kind of a theme is more the humorist type of fantasy, which there were some big ones that were popping up here, including Xanth by Piers Anthony. Now, Xanth is not for me. I've tried to read them. They're kind of silly, and a lot of people read them, and some people read them when they were like younger, even though they're not necessarily marketed toward children, but is a big one that was just kind of the silly ones. And then while it did technically make the mark, it was more like the tail end, but Robert Asprin, who also did some like fun ones, started in the 70s and then kind of went on into the 80s from there. Another author that I will mention. And we then did have as well, though, some things that were more the kind of the classic fantasy style. On the classic side, things that came out, including a whole bunch of Patricia McKillop. But Riddlemaster, there was a trilogy for that, and then she also wrote quite a lot of stuff as well. Riddlemaster, I tried, and I really couldn't. It didn't land for me. The writing style is one of those things. Sometimes when you're reading things that are a little bit older, it just doesn't always mesh. But it felt like it was older than the 70s, even though it's the 70s, and so that's kind of again something also you'll see sometimes where it's the kind of the very classic style, and at that time they were going back even further. So something, and then Mary Stewart had the Arthurian saga, which I feel like I probably read, but I don't specifically know if I read. But Arthurian stuff is, we've seen, and every decade has had some Arthurian stuff, but that was a big one as well. So it's again, though, going back, very, a classic subject material and doing that type of thing. So something that you also see. An author that I feel like I absolutely do have to mention as well is Diana Wynne Jones, because Diana Wynne Jones, very prolific, mostly children, young adult author, but wrote so many books that came out in the 70s. I didn't realize how many. So that coming again from talking about in the 60s, there's a lot of like beloved children's books or younger reading books from the 60s that are fantasy. And so I think maybe that continues here where Diana Wynne Jones was writing those younger books. But an author I've not actually read anything from, but a ton of books, or at least not that I remember. I might have read some of her stuff when I was younger, but also just had an absolute ton of stuff. Now, there are definitely some other authors that I want to talk about as well. There's so much actually in this decade here. I do want to throw out some notable like single books that were really, really big. Some of which I actually didn't realize, or at least one I did not realize was from the 70s. But so we have The Princess Bride, William Goldman, which is it's a great book. Obviously, it's more well known even for the movie, but that was published here in the 70s, and that's kind of its own different, fun, lighthearted thing with the fantasy type of thing. The Never-Ending Story by Michael Ende, also coming here from the 70s, continuing kind of the little bit more younger side maybe. Watership Down by Richard Adams here, which that's debatable if that's for kids or not. It's kind of been looked at it, but I feel like it's one of those stories that is looked at like it's for kids, although it's actually there's like a lot of content in there that's pretty deep as well, but that comes from here. The one though I didn't realize is the book Bridge to Terabithia, which there was a movie years ago that was newer-ish. It's not anymore, but is past 2000 at least. So that's by Catherine Patterson. I didn't realize that was actually from the 70s. I knew it was a book. And then Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt, which I don't know that I've read, but also specifically stood out as a name and not something I realized that was from back in the 70s as well. But there might have been a movie of that too. It's very possible. So there's just some notable like single books or things that are popular there as well. And then a few other authors that I will specifically mention that wrote a ton of books, include or started writing books at least in the 70s, including C.J. Sherry, who did write a lot of sci-fi as well as fantasy. Octavia Butler, which I know there's a few of her books that are still very popular today as well, that I've definitely heard. And then one I'm not familiar with, but wrote a fair amount of fantasy books that actually look really interesting. Phyllis Eisenstein. Not familiar with that author, but there are quite a few books I figured I'd pop up here as well. And then you did have, as well, like I mentioned, in the 60s and kind of before, sci-fi and fantasy not really having as much of a divide. So there are several authors who, I didn't include a lot of these in the 60s video because some of them are primarily sci-fi, but also wrote fantasy, but they all did specifically write books that are classified as fantasy in the 70s. So that's your Paul Anderson, L. Sprague de Camp, Samuel Delaney, Lynn Carter, some of them which were writing in existing properties like Conan or Tarzan or like things like that as well, but you had those. And then also Tanith Lee, an author that I am newer to, did write some fantasy here, including the Tales of the Flat Earth did start in the 70s, but that went on more to 80s, but also just wrote some other fantasy here as well. And she wrote a lot of sci-fi as well, but is an author definitely that I'm still interested to try a lot more out. And then quickly, I will mention a few more names of authors who actually did start publishing fantasy in the 70s, but were mostly like 80s and after, including Robin McKinley, author I still need to read, Elizabeth Lynn, author I still need to read. And then actually, I didn't realize this, but Glenn Cook published his first book in the very late 70s before his more well-known books that we'll talk about in the 80s video. But so some authors there that also kind of started at the tail end, including, I think I mentioned Robert Asprin already as well. But if I didn't, he started like right toward the end of the decade as well with his books. But the big one that I haven't mentioned so far that I think is actually really important and was influential in a big way in things that came later is Terry Brooks and the Sword of Shannara, which the original books, Sword of Shannara trilogy, was in the 70s. Now, I mentioned this because this is something that's really, really impactful because of the fact that, as is pretty well known, at least the original Sword of Shannara was, for all intents and purposes, a retelling of Lord of the Rings and Tolkien. And it was kind of the first example of let's just repackage this. And I'm not saying it's a total ripoff. It's very intentionally kind of following that mold. But it's really well known that it's, especially the first book is basically Lord of the Rings. And so that's an important thing because Tolkien clones became big. And publishers were pushing for it because that's what people wanted. Because again, Lord of the Rings was really popular. It kicked off a lot of the golden age of fantasy, and it also was something that people wanted more of. And they weren't necessarily going to be getting more Lord of the Rings, although there's lots of other related things. But so trying to find that and just tell similar stories and duplicate that's a big thing, and that had big lasting impacts well past the 70s. And so, in a lot of ways, I feel like the Shannara Chronicles is such a whether good or bad, but is a very, very big and influential series from the 70s as well. And we still sometimes will see that kind of things as well. But for a long time, we would see a lot of the mainstream books, and there were still authors definitely doing other stuff, but there were a lot of mainstream books that were just kind of, Tolkien clones. And it's something too that you can find lots of those books, and it's definitely not everything, but I feel like it's important to mention that because of the fact that was a pretty big part of the 70s. But there was also all kinds of other stuff, as I mentioned, here in the 70s, and so I thought this was especially interesting because definitely some stuff that I've read that I've really liked. And Covenant is definitely, it's on my favorite series list. Amber, I'm really excited to continue, and then there's a bunch of these that I just series that I really do want to get to or want to try out these authors. So lots of really, really interesting stuff in the 70s in this decade as well. And it'll be interesting to talk about here kind of where we go into the 80s. But so yeah, 70s kind of the lawless, the wild, experimental, and anything goes in fantasy, which I think is a really cool time to look at just how many different kinds of really well-known fantasy there are. When we didn't have as much of that kind of in some decades. There wasn't as much that was at least well known or big. So interesting decade for sure. But let me know your thoughts on any of these books from the 70s, or if there's some of your favorites here, or if there's some things that I missed. I tried to be pretty broad here because there was really a lot, but I'm sure there's definitely still things that I missed or did not get in here. So I would love to hear your thoughts here on the 70s. But it's another decade that does definitely make that argument for being such a big decade in fantasy, and which there's not been a decade that's been like a bad decade, honestly. For the most part, there's some great stuff everywhere, but 70s a big time, and we'll talk about next time in the 80s and see where we ended up. That's really it for this one though, so make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Check the links in the description as always for the Patreon if you want to support what I do, as well as the Wizard of the Enclave Discord if you want to chat books, whether any of these books, other books, really anything at all. It's a lot of fun and we'd love to have you. And of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.